Oh, God is good, so true and bright. His love shines strong, His grace is light. Righteous and holy in all His ways, His truth will guide us all our days. He never changes, still the same. A mighty rock, a steadfast name. His justice shines like morning sun. His love eternal, second to none. Love and justice, hand in hand. God is mercy, He takes a stand. Inseparable, shining bright. God is justice, God is light. He is the truth, He is the way. Through Him alone we live today. His judgment leads to hope and grace, calling the lost to His embrace. His mercy reaches far and wide. He lifts the weak, stands by our side. He molds our heart with mighty hands. Through Christ we live, we stand. Love and justice, hand in hand. God is mercy, He takes a stand. Inseparable, shining bright. God is justice, His justice. God is light. His word is truth, His word. He lights the way, guides our steps from day to day. Walk with kindness, live in grace. Follow His steps, seek His face. Through Christ His love was shown so bright. Justice and grace in perfect light. Lift up His name, for He is King. His reign is love, His praises ring. Love and justice, hand in hand. God is mercy, He takes a stand. Inseparable, shining bright. God is justice, God is light. Oh, His word is truth, His word is truth. It lights the way, guides our steps from day to day. Walk with kindness, live in grace. Follow His steps, seek His face. Through Christ His love was shown so bright. Justice and grace in perfect light. Lift up His name, for He is King. His reign is love, His reign is love. His reign is praise, His reign is love. His praises ring. Love and justice, hand in hand. God is mercy, He takes a stand. Inseparable, shining bright. God is justice, God is light. His reign is love, His praises
Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive.
Yeah.
I'm so glad to have you all back with us,
To be back.
and especially Pastor Danini and the Believe Quartet. I know that you guys have been on vacation. You are back We're ready to jump into some more fascinating concepts. This week, we are taking a deep dive into Sabbath School lesson number 6. It is focused on God's love of justice. And before we get into it, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, share it with your friends so that they can join us on this journey.
Always a pleasure to be back. And this is an interesting lesson for sure. I'm looking forward to unpacking it with you.
Me too.
Yeah.
As I was reading through the lesson this week, one of the things that really struck me was the contrast between the God that is presented in the Bible and the way that the deities were worshipped in the ancient Near East. These ancient gods, they were often portrayed as unpredictable and demanding and even cruel. I mean, you almost get the feeling that they were more like these cosmic dictators than benevolent deities.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I think you've hit upon a crucial distinction here. The ancient Near Eastern world was filled with all these different gods who were seen as very fickle and often vindictive. Their favor had to be constantly earned through all these sacrifices and offerings, and even then there was no guarantee of blessing. So this created a climate of fear and uncertainty where people were constantly trying to appease these deities, never knowing what might set them off.
Oh, that sounds exhausting. Just imagine living with that constant sense of dread, of never really knowing if you were doing enough to please the gods.
Yeah.
One of the things that's particularly disturbing is the idea that these deities often demanded child sacrifice is the ultimate act of appeasement.
Yeah, that's right. It's definitely a chilling aspect of their religious practices. And it highlights the profound difference between these ancient deities and the God that's revealed in the Bible. In the Bible, God is consistently portrayed as a God of perfect goodness, an unchanging character, and with this deep concern for justice and righteousness. This fundamental difference, this stark contrast, really lays the foundation for a completely different kind of relationship with the Divine One that's based on hope and trust, rather than fear and appeasement.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. It's like stepping out of this dark, oppressive room into the warmth and the light of a beautiful day. When you understand the character of God as revealed in the Bible, it changes your whole perspective on life and on faith, on everything.
Absolutely. And that understanding of God's character is really crucial because it sets the stage for understanding the central concept of this Sabbath School lesson, which is this: God's love and his justice are not separate entities, but are deeply and intricately intertwined. They are, in fact, inseparable. In the Bible, true love requires justice.
I have to admit, that's a concept that I have always wrestled with. We often think of love and justice as being kind of at odds with each other. Love is about mercy and forgiveness, while justice seems to be more about punishment and consequences. So how do we reconcile these two seemingly opposing ideas?
Well, I think it's a tension that we all grapple with to some degree, and I think it stems from our limited human understanding of both love and justice. We tend to view them through the lens of our own experiences, which are inherently flawed and incomplete. Our love is often conditional. Our sense of justice is often tainted by our own biases and prejudices.
So how do we break free from those limitations and begin to understand God's love and justice in a way that makes sense? How can we wrap our minds around the idea that justice can actually be an expression of love?
That is really the heart of the matter, isn't it? And this is where the lesson gets really interesting. There are a number of passages that you've highlighted in your notes that directly address this tension, and they consistently present justice as the fruit of God's love. One of the most powerful analogies that I came across in my studies is this. Imagine a perfectly crafted painting, a masterpiece, and it's vandalized by some outside force. This act of vandalism represents the way that sin has marred God's perfect creation. The act of restoring that painting to its original beauty, that's what God's justice aims to achieve. It's not about retribution or punishment for its own sake, but about setting things right, healing the wounds, and ultimately restoring the masterpiece to its intended glory.
That's a beautiful analogy. And it really helps to see justice not as this cold and impersonal force, but as this loving act of restoration. It makes me think about the passage in Isaiah where it talks about God creating this new heavens and new earth. It sounds like the ultimate act of restoration, the culmination of God's justice and love working together to bring about a perfect and harmonious world.
Exactly. And that's the hope that we cling to the promise that God's love and justice will ultimately prevail and all things will be made new. But this brings us to another point that you've highlighted in your notes, and one that often causes a lot of confusion and even controversy, the idea of God's unchanging nature.
Right. If God is truly unchanging, how do we explain those verses in the Bible that describe God repenting or relenting? If he's truly perfect and all-knowing, shouldn't his plans be set in stone? Don't those verses suggest that God is changing his mind, that he's backtracking on his decisions?
It's a valid question and one that has puzzled theologians and Bible scholars for centuries. But I think the key lies in understanding the nature of God's character and the meaning of the words that are being used in those specific passages. When we say God is unchanging, we're referring to his core attributes, his love, his holiness, his justice, his goodness. These attributes are eternal and unchanging. They're the very foundation of his being.
Okay, so it's not that God's moral compass is shifting, but rather that his actions might adjust based on the circumstances.
Precisely. You've highlighted a great analogy in your notes. The example of a loving parent who might promise their child a special treat, but then withhold it if the child misbehaves. Now, the parent's love for the child hasn't changed, but their actions reflect the child's choices. In the same way, God's love for humanity remains constant, but his actions might shift in response to our choices, always remaining in harmony with his unchanging character.
Okay, that's helpful. So when the Bible describes God as repenting or relenting, it's not suggesting that he made a mistake or is somehow flawed.
Not at all. The Hebrew word that's often translated as repent in those instances actually carries a different nuance than the way we typically understand repentance. It conveys more of a sense of sorrow or a change of course in response to human actions, not remorse for wrongdoing on God's part.
So it's more like God is adapting to the reality of the situation, adjusting his course of action while remaining true to his character.
Exactly. You've really grasped the essence of this concept, and this is where the idea of conditional prophecy comes into play. Many of God's pronouncements are not set in stone, but are contingent upon human responses. And, your notes include an excellent example, the story of the Ninevites.
Yes, God declared that he would destroy Nineveh because of their wickedness, but when they repented, he relented and spared the city.
Exactly. And that highlights a crucial point. Human actions can actually influence God's actions. It wasn't that God changed his mind about the inherent wrongness of Nineveh's actions, but rather he responded to their genuine repentance. He saw their change of heart and adjusted his course accordingly, remaining true to his character of both justice and mercy.
This is fascinating. It really reframes how I understand these stories and God's interactions with humanity. I'm eager to dive into more of these examples.
Me too.
Yeah.
It's amazing what we can glean from looking at these stories with fresh eyes.
Yeah, it really is amazing how these seemingly small details in the text can completely change our understanding of a story. Mm-hmm. The way you highlighted those specific words in your notes really brings this whole point to life. It's like we've been reading these stories with one set of lenses, and now suddenly we're seeing them with this whole new level of clarity.
Absolutely. And I love how this concept of conditional prophecy challenges the notion that God is some kind of distant, unfeeling puppet master who's just pulling strings and dictating every outcome. It suggests this much more dynamic relationship between God and humanity, where our choices actually matter, where our actions have real consequences, and where God is actively engaged in this unfolding drama of human history, responding to us with both justice and mercy.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to put it. And it brings to mind another example that you've highlighted, God's interaction with King Nebuchadnezzar. It's a story that's both fascinating and a little bit terrifying, if I'm being honest. I know what you mean. Nebuchadnezzar, this mighty king of Babylon, reduced to the level of an animal grazing in the fields. It's this stark image of what happens when human pride and arrogance collide with divine justice.
Precisely. God warned Nebuchadnezzar about the consequences of his pride and his self-exaltation. But the king, he was blinded by his own power and hubris and ignored those warnings. And so God allowed him to experience the full weight of his choices, stripping him of his sanity and his kingdom, humbling him before the whole world.
But even in that act of judgment, there's this glimmer of hope, right? God didn't completely abandon Nebuchadnezzar to his fate. When the king finally acknowledged God's sovereignty, when he humbled himself and repented, God restored him to his position. It's a powerful reminder that even when we fall, even when we experience the consequences of our own rebellion, God's mercy is always available. He's always ready to forgive and restore those who turn to him with a contrite heart.
Absolutely. God's judgments are never arbitrary or vindictive. They're always rooted in his love and justice, and they always offer this path to restoration. That's a truth that we see woven throughout the entire Bible, from the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, all the way to the promise of a new heaven and a new earth in the book of Revelation.
That's so encouraging. It means that no matter how far we've strayed, no matter how messed up our lives have become, we can always find our way back to God. He's always waiting for us with open arms, ready to welcome us home.
And that brings us to a really crucial question. If we are called to reflect God's character, if we're meant to be ambassadors of his love and justice in the world, How do we practically live out this understanding in our daily lives? It's one thing to talk about God's justice and mercy in these abstract terms, but it's another thing entirely to put those principles into practice, especially when we're faced with real life situations that challenge our sense of fairness and our capacity for forgiveness.
Yeah, that's the $1,000,000 question, isn't it? It's so easy to get caught up in these intellectual debates about theology and ethics, but it's much harder to translate those ideas into tangible actions, especially when we're dealing with the complexities of human relationships and just the messiness of everyday life. So where do we even begin?
Well, I think it starts with understanding that God's love and justice are not separate entities, but are intertwined aspects of his very character. We can't truly love others without seeking justice for them and for ourselves, and we can't pursue justice without being motivated by love and compassion.
That makes sense. But, justice often seems like such a grand, abstract concept. How do we make it tangible, something that we can actually practice in our day-to-day lives?
Nah.
I mean, I'm not a judge or a lawyer.
Yeah.
I don't have the power to right all the wrongs in the world.
You're right. We're not all called to be judges or lawyers, but we can all be agents of justice in our own spheres of influence. Think of justice as fairness, treating people with equity and respect, regardless of their background or their beliefs or their social standing. It's about advocating for those who are marginalized or oppressed, speaking truth to power, and standing up for what's right even when it's uncomfortable or unpopular.
So it's about recognizing that our actions, no matter how small they may seem, can contribute to building a more just and equitable world. That's a powerful thought.
It is. Each act of kindness, each word of encouragement, each decision to stand up for what's right, it's like adding a small stone to a mosaic. Individually, those stones might seem insignificant, but together they create this beautiful and intricate work of art.
I love that image. It reminds me that we're all part of something so much bigger than ourselves, and that our choices, even the seemingly small ones, can have this ripple effect that extends far beyond our immediate circles.
Exactly. It's about recognizing our interconnectedness and understanding that the pursuit of justice is not a solitary endeavor, but a collective responsibility. We're all in this together, and we each have a part to play in creating a world that reflects God's heart.
But what about those situations where we've been personally wronged? How do we balance the desire for justice with the call to love our enemies? That's a tension that I've really struggled with, and I'm sure many of our listeners have as well.
It's one of the most difficult challenges of the Christian life, and honestly, there's no easy answer. It's a tension we all have to navigate, and it requires a deep level of humility and grace and reliance on God's wisdom and strength.
It's so easy to get caught up in our own hurt and anger, and to want to see the person who wronged us suffer the consequences of their actions. But I know that's not the path of Christ. He calls us to this higher standard, to a love that transcends our natural inclinations.
Yeah, you've hit upon a crucial point. Loving our enemies doesn't mean condoning or excusing their actions. It's about choosing to respond with grace and compassion, even when every fiber of our being is screaming for retaliation. It's about recognizing that our ultimate allegiance is to God and to his kingdom, not to our own hurt feelings or desire for revenge.
That's a humbling thought. It requires a level of surrender that I'm not always comfortable with. It means letting go of my need to be right, my need to see justice done on my own terms.
It does, but it's also incredibly liberating. It frees us from the burden of carrying bitterness and resentment, which can poison our hearts and just distort our perspective. It allows us to move forward with grace and forgiveness, trusting that God is ultimately the one who will bring about true justice.
That's a powerful reminder. It's so easy to get caught up in that cycle of offense and retaliation.
Yeah,
But ultimately, that path only leads to more pain and brokenness.
that's right. The path of Christ is a path of healing and reconciliation. It's a path that requires courage and humility and a willingness to surrender our own desires to the will of God.
It's challenging, but it's also incredibly inspiring. It reminds me of the story of Corrie ten Boom, who survived the horrors of a Nazi concentration camp and later forgave one of her former captors. It's this amazing example of the transformative power of God's love and grace.
It is, and it's a testament to the fact that even in the darkest of circumstances, even in the face of unimaginable evil, God's love can shine through and bring about healing and redemption.
This discussion has really challenged me to rethink my understanding of justice and to consider how I can more actively pursue it in my own life, not just in terms of these grand gestures, but in the everyday choices I make, in the way I treat others, and in the words that I speak, and the attitudes that I cultivate.
Yeah, I think that's a valuable takeaway for all of us. Justice isn't just something that we passively wait for God to bring about. It's something we're called to actively participate in, both individually and collectively. It's about being the change we want to see in the world, as Gandhi famously said.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that the pursuit of justice is not just about achieving fairness and equity in external systems and structures. It's also about cultivating a heart of righteousness, a heart that reflects God's love and compassion, a heart that seeks to heal and restore rather than to punish and condemn.
You've captured the essence of it beautifully. It's about allowing God's love and justice to permeate every aspect of our lives, from our personal relationships to our engagement with the wider world.
It's a challenging call, but also an incredibly hopeful one. It means that we're not alone in this pursuit of justice. We have the power of God working in us and through us, empowering us to make a difference, no matter how small our actions may seem.
That's the foundation of our confidence and our hope. We can trust that God will ultimately bring about justice and righteousness, and we can be a part of that beautiful unfolding, participating in his redemptive work in the world.
This has been such a rich and insightful conversation. I'm grateful for your wisdom and for the way you've helped us to delve into these profound truths. I feel like I've gained a whole new perspective on God's love and justice.
It's been my pleasure. I always enjoy these deep dives. They challenge me to think more deeply and to live more intentionally.
I think this conversation has given our listeners a lot to chew on as well. It's raised some important questions and challenged us to move beyond these simplistic understandings of love and justice.
You're right. It's easy to get caught up in black and white thinking, to view love and justice as these opposing forces. But what we've seen today is that they're actually two sides of the same coin. They're inseparable aspects of God's character, and they're meant to work together in our lives to bring about healing and restoration and true shalom.
That's a beautiful way to summarize what we've been talking about. And it leads me to a final question that I think is worth pondering as we continue on our journey of faith. If God's love and justice are so deeply intertwined, how can we become more intentional about reflecting both of those attributes in our own lives? How can we move beyond simply talking about justice to actually living it out in these tangible ways?
That's a question that each of us needs to wrestle with individually. But I believe that as we immerse ourselves in God's word, as we seek his guidance through prayer, and as we allow his spirit to transform our hearts, we'll begin to see the world through his eyes and to respond with his love and justice.
Well, this deep dive has certainly given us plenty to ponder. We'll continue our exploration of God's love and justice in our next segment, where we'll delve into the challenging topic of final judgment.
I'm looking forward to delving even deeper into these truths. Until then, may God's peace and grace be with you.
Welcome back to our deep dive into God's love of justice. It's been an incredible journey so far, exploring the complexities of God's character and how his unchanging nature kind of intertwines with this responsive love and justice.
We've unpacked some pretty challenging concepts, haven't we? And I think what's become really clear is that God's love and justice aren't these like separate competing forces, but rather two sides of the same coin. They're deeply interconnected and they work together in these beautiful and often mysterious ways.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We've seen how God's judgments, while sometimes they're really difficult to understand, are always rooted in his love and always offer this path to restoration. And we've been challenged, I think, to reflect God's character in our own lives, to be these agents of his love and justice in the world, even in the face of personal wrongs and systemic injustices.
Absolutely. And as we kind of wrap up our deep dive today, I want to shift our focus to a very specific aspect of God's justice that often sparks debate and even controversy: his final judgment. It's a topic that can evoke a wide range of emotions: fear, anxiety, even anger.
Yeah. You highlighted this passage in your notes that I think really captures this tension. It's a quote from C.S. Lewis. And he wrote, "If you are thinking of becoming a Christian, I warn you, you are embarking on something which is going to take the whole of your brain's heart and will." And I think that sentiment applies perfectly to this concept of final judgment. It forces us to confront our deepest fears and our most cherished hopes.
Exactly. And it compels us to really grapple with this question: how do we reconcile the idea of a loving God with the reality of a final judgment? It's a question that has puzzled theologians and philosophers for centuries. And honestly, there are no easy answers.
I think what makes this topic so difficult is that it forces us to confront our own mortality, our own accountability before a holy and righteous God. It's unsettling to think that one day we're going to have to stand before him and give an account of our lives.
Yeah. And it's tempting to try to soften the edges of this doctrine, to kind of downplay the severity of God's judgment or to create loopholes for those we deem good enough to escape it. But I think the Bible is pretty clear on this point. There will be a final judgment, and all of us will be held accountable for our choices.
So where does that leave us? I mean, if we can't escape judgment, how can we possibly face it without being consumed by fear and despair? Is there any hope for us?
Here's where I think it's crucial to remember what we've been talking about this whole time: God's unchanging character. We've established that God is perfectly just and righteous, and his character is the guarantee that his judgment will be based on truth and fairness, not on whims or favoritism.
That's such a key point, because if we believe that God is arbitrary or capricious, that he doles out rewards and punishments based on some kind of cosmic lottery, then of course we're going to be terrified of judgment. But if we believe that God is perfectly just, that he sees the whole picture, the entire tapestry of our lives, then I think there's a glimmer of hope.
Absolutely. You've highlighted a verse in your notes from Psalm 139 that speaks to this beautifully. It says, "You have searched me, Lord, and you know me. When I sit and when I rise, you perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you, Lord, know it completely. This is the God who will judge us, the God who knows us intimately, who sees our hearts, who understands our motivations, and who takes everything into account."
That's so incredibly reassuring. It means that we can trust that God's going to take everything into account, every mitigating factor, every extenuating circumstance. He won't just judge us based on our worst moments or our biggest failures. He'll see the whole picture, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Exactly. And his judgment will be based on that comprehensive understanding. It won't be about condemning us for our imperfections, but about bringing about the state of perfect justice, of righting wrongs, and of restoring balance to the universe.
But there's still this question of those who have never had a chance to know God, those who have lived and died without ever hearing the gospel. How will they be judged?
That's a profound question. And honestly, I don't have all the answers. I don't think any human being does. But I'm comforted by the truth that God is both merciful and just. He desires that all should be saved, and I trust that his judgment will reflect that desire.
It's a mystery that we may not fully understand until we ourselves stand before God. But in the meantime, we can cling to the hope that God's love and justice will prevail, and that his ultimate goal is not to condemn, but to redeem.
You've captured the essence of it beautifully. Well, this deep dive has been quite a journey of discovery, exploring the depths of God's love and justice. We've grappled with these challenging concepts and encountered these profound truths that have shaped our understanding of God and his character.
It's been an incredible journey, and I think it's safe to say that we've all learned a great deal. As we conclude our deep dive today, what are some of the key takeaways that you would hope our listeners will kind of carry with them?
I hope they'll grasp this profound truth that God's love and justice are inseparable. They're the twin pillars of his character and the very foundation of our hope.
And I also hope that they'll be encouraged by the realization that God's character is unchanging. He's always faithful, always loving, always just, we can trust him completely, even when we don't understand his ways.
And finally, I pray that they'll be challenged to actually live out God's love and justice in their own lives, to be these beacons of his grace and truth in a world that's so desperately in need of both.
Thank you for joining us on this journey. We've covered a lot of ground, but the exploration of God's love and justice is a lifelong pursuit. May this deep dive inspire you to continue seeking learning and growing in your understanding of God and his incredible character.
And may his love and justice fill your hearts and guide your steps until we meet again on our next deep dive. Until then, may God bless you and keep you.
Balance, no one can see justice and mercy and harmony. But God is perfect, faithful and true. He rules with love in all he'll do. Holy and righteous, steady and strong. His love and justice make right from wrong. One day the sky will open wide. We'll see his glory fill the sky. Mercy and truth will shine so bright. His love will lead us home tonight. Justice and mercy and harmony. But God is perfect, faithful and true. He rules with love in all he'll do. Holy and righteous, steady and strong. His love and justice make right from wrong. One day